Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Once upon a time, in a kingdom cloaked by forests, dark and wild, there lived a queen who longed for a child. Though she prayed to the heavens and sought counsel from the wise, her womb remained barren and her heart grew heavy. One winter's evening, as the first snow fell, she sat by her chamber window and made a terrible vow. "Let the snow take my blood," she whispered. "Let it drink my offering, and if it will grant me a child, I care not the cost." She took a small dagger and drew it across her palm. The crimson drops fell like rubies from the windowsill, hungrily swallowed by the snow. The white turned red, then black, and for a moment she thought the snow shifted just a bit, though no wind stirred the air. Days passed, and the queen began to feel the stirrings of life within her. But the joy she felt was sharp and fleeting, for her dreams were plagued by visions of a barefoot child walking on frozen ground, surrounded by black trees that wept blood. Yet, when she woke, drenched in sweat, she dismissed the dreams as foolishness and caressed the scar across her palm, for at last her deepest wish would be fulfilled. As the months dragged on, the queen's health began to wane. Her skin became ashen, her voice grew weak, and the spark of life in her eyes dimmed away. The midwives whispered among themselves that they had never seen a pregnancy so strange. When the child finally came, it was in the dead of night, beneath a blood moon. The queen screamed once, twice, then fell silent as the babe emerged. The midwives delivered the child with trembling hands, a girl with a tuft of silver hair atop her tiny head, as if kissed by the frost that drank her mother's blood. And the queen, now lifeless, lay with her face turned toward the window, her lips frozen in a faint smile, as the sun began to rise. As the grief-stricken king looked upon his newborn daughter, he declared the child's name to be Snow White. And the beautiful baby sat there in the morning sunlight, the perfect child they'd always wanted. And it was summer, warm, beautiful summer. The child grew, and with each passing year, her beauty became more unnatural. The servants whispered that she never cried as a babe, not even when the winter winds howled like starving wolves. Instead, she would stare silently, or smile charmingly, and steal away the hearts of those whose lucky eyes found her. But not all who saw little Snow White were bewitched by the young girl's shimmering eyes and smile. Eventually, the king took himself another wife, a woman of breathtaking beauty, with flawless features sharp enough to cut glass, and a regal bearing that commanded the very air around her. She had no love for the king, nor for the kingdom she now ruled. Her only passion was her own reflection, which she gazed upon in a mirror of polished obsidian, its surface as dark and impenetrable as her soul. The ancient looking-glass was framed in blackened gold, adorned with twisting serpents with red eyes. Every morning, the queen stood before it, looked at herself, and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of the land?" To this the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." And she was satisfied, for she knew that the mirror could only speak the truth. More time passed, and from the moment she could walk, Snow White easily enchanted all she encountered. Her shining hair gleamed even on the grayest of days, and though untouched by time, it remained the purest shade of fresh fallen snow under a winter moon. Her skin was perfect and luminous, and her plumping lips the color of ripe cherries. Servants paused their work to marvel at her. Foreigners brought tales of her beauty back to their lands, claiming no other princess could compare. But the wicked queen's mirror, the only reflecting surface she permitted in the castle, was poison to all eyes but her own. The handsome king, a man of noble bearing and strong features, would look into the glass to see a hideous ogre staring back at him. And little Snow White, beautiful and perfect as she was, saw a pale, deathly girl in the mirror, gaunt and hollow-eyed, and it filled her with horrible dread. "Stepmother," Snow White would cry, "I hate to see the sight of my own reflection so much. One day, I hope to be as beautiful as you." The queen's lips curved into a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps one day after I am long gone," she said, her voice low and honeyed with false warmth, "you will be the prettiest in all the land." But her stepmother could not bear the adoration that Snow White received, nor how the air seemed to brighten in her presence. And every smile and sneaking glance became a thorn in her side, and her hatred of the little girl grew with every passing day. The princess's beauty was not hers to control, and this truth, more than any, festered in her heart like a venomous rot. At night, the queen would stand before the mirror, curling her claws around its gilded frame. Her reflection looked back, beautiful and unyielding, but that was no longer enough. "Mirror on the wall," she would ask, "who is the fairest of the land?" The mirror's surface rippled like pooled ink, as it said, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." "Snow White?" The woman spat the name like poison from her tongue, clenching her fists so angrily that her long nails drew blood. "Snow White?" And in the darkness of her chamber, the wicked queen began to plot. One day, Snow White came to her stepmother with wildflowers, her hair catching the golden light of the throne room as she approached. "Stepmother," she said innocently, "I picked these for you." The queen accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing against Snow White's for the briefest of moments. "How lovely," she said through her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Snow White curtsied and turned away, skipping toward the gardens once more as her laughter rang through the air like wind chimes. The queen watched her go, her chest heaving with suppressed hatred, and the flowers withered and blackened in her grasp. The next morning, the queen summoned a huntsman to her chambers, a broad-shouldered man weathered by years of labor across the lands, with hands thickly calloused from wielding axe and knife. She commanded him to take Snow White out into the woods. "Kill her," she said, "and to prove that you've done it, bring me back her heart." The huntsman's loyalty to the crown was unwavering, but still he hesitated, for Snow White was just more than a child, innocent and kind. But he dared not disobey, for the queen was renowned for her wrath. So he bowed his head and left the queen alone with her dark thoughts. She traced her fingers over her own face in the magic mirror. "A pure heart," she whispered to herself, "untouched by wickedness, untouched by sin." The queen reached into her vanity and drew forth an ancient tome, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed and brittle. She turned to a page marked with a blood-red ribbon and read the jagged script in some long-forgotten language older than the castle itself. "Eat of the heart, and youth shall return, as does spring after winter snow. The flesh will mend, the soul will thrive, and beauty reigns eternal." Her hands trembled as she closed the book, the weight of its promise filling her chest with dark delight. She imagined her face restored to its most youthful beauty, her essence surpassing even that of the gods. Snow White, with her cursed hair, would be the vessel of her rebirth. "Soon," she hissed, "I shall be fairest of all." The huntsman led Snow White deep into the woods, beyond the sunlight, where the trees grew taller, and a chill settled in the air, though it was not the chill of winter. At last, they reached a clearing, and the huntsman turned to face the girl. "Why have we come here, huntsman?" she asked. "Forgive me, princess," he said, drawing his knife. Snow White stepped back, her small hands raised. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't hurt me." For a moment, the knife faltered in his hand, but before he could decide, Snow White darted into the woods, her feet light as a doe's. She ran blindly, branches clawing at her arms and face, and gnarled roots rising up to trip her. Behind her, the huntsman shouted, his voice growing louder as he closed the distance. Spying a fallen branch thick with moss, Snow White snatched it up and hid behind a tree, her small frame trembling as she listened for his heavy footfalls approaching. When the huntsman appeared, Snow White leapt from the shadows with a cry, swinging the branch with all her strength and striking him squarely in the side of his head, and he stumbled, collapsing to his knees. The knife fell from his hand, skittering across the forest floor to the little feet of Snow White. The huntsman looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt. "Spare me," he pleaded. "Spare me, as I would have spared you." The princess stood over him. "Leave me be, then," she said, dropping the branch. "Go, and never come for me again." Before the huntsman could rise, thick black vines shot forth from the forest, wrapping around his legs and arms. He screamed as they tightened, struggling to free himself, but it was no use. The earth itself had come to claim him, dragging him violently across the ground. Thorny tendrils snagged and lurched, ripping into his pores and snaking into his veins. Snow White dared one final glance over her shoulder as she fled. The huntsman's broken body dangled high among the branches like a tangled marionette, his face locked forever in a silent scream. Then a great hawk descended, and with a sudden, violent motion, plunged its talons into the huntsman's chest and tore out his heart, before taking to the sky once again with a piercing cry, leaving a trail of blood below. The queen in her chambers turned sharply at the sound of a soft thud upon her dressing table. There, amid her perfumes and jewels, lay a fresh, human heart, still slick with dark blood. She stared at it, glistening in the dim light, and her lips parted in thrill. "At last," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for the organ. It was still warm as she pressed it to her lips. "At last, I shall have her heart." The queen called for a servant and bade him visit the king's chambers with the dreadful news of his young daughter's death in the forest. As the servant departed, she turned her gaze to the hearth, where a small cauldron bubbled, and carefully placed the meat into the broth. She sprinkled a handful of salt crystals like snow onto the organ, and with a bone-handled ladle, she began to stir. The gurgling stew filled the room with the metallic sense of death and despair, and the queen watched her concoction simmer as low hunger rumbled in the pit of her stomach. "Beauty eternal," she murmured, ladling out the tender and steaming heart onto a shining golden plate. She used a silver knife to cut into the flesh. The meat was soft, rich and succulent, almost sickly sweet, and the wicked queen savored each bite, with her eyes half closed in ecstasy, until the plate was as spotless as her own visage. She leaned back in her chair, her laughter echoing through the stone halls. "Snow White is no more," she said to herself, "and I am once again the fairest of all." Meanwhile, deep in the forest, far across the kingdom, the poor princess ran on without daring to look back. Just as her legs threatened to give way, she saw a small figure ahead. No, not a figure, but a house. It was a little cottage, barely more than a silhouette against the darkening sky. Its thatched roof sagged slightly, and its wooden walls were weathered and worn, and Snow White carried herself, numb with exhaustion, to the little front door. Her small fist rapped against the wood 3 times, and she waited, but no answer came. She knocked again, louder this time, her voice cracking as she called out, "Please, is anyone there?" Still, there was no reply. With no other choice, she pushed open the door. The room inside was dim and cold. A small table stood at the center, covered with a snow-white cloth that looked as if it had never known a stain. 7 little plates sat upon it, each with a spoon resting neatly beside it, and 7 knives and forks and 7 mugs. Against the far wall, 7 little beds stood in perfect formation. each one covered with blankets smooth and untouched. Snow White hesitated, but her hunger outweighed her unease. She moved to the table and took a small piece of bread from each plate, and nibbled on a few vegetables and drank a small sip of wine from each mug. When she finished and her eyelids fluttered with drowsiness, she moved to the beds. The first bed was too long, the second too sunken in, and the third was too soft. It wasn't until she reached the seventh bed that she found one just right. The cool blankets soon warmed around her as she curled into a ball, spilling her silver hair across the pillow, and closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep. After dark, the masters of the house returned home. They were 7 little men who mined for ore in the mountains. They filled the cottage one by one and lit their 7 candles, when one said, "Who has sat in my chair?" Then a second voice cried, "Who has sipped from my mug?" Then a third and a fourth, until all 7 shouted, "Who has eaten my vegetables? Who has eaten my bread? Who has touched my plate, my fork, my knife?" And there, lying in the 7th bed, was the girl, her chest rising and falling with each quiet breath. Her hair, white as freshly fallen snow, spread across the pillow like a soft frozen veil. The dwarves cried out in amazement. Such an ethereal beauty had appeared from nowhere, asleep in their home, and they could hardly believe their eyes. They gathered around the bed, their candles casting golden light over her. "Who is she?" one of the little men whispered. "Where did she come from?" asked another. "She looks like a princess," murmured a third. "But what is a princess doing here in our cottage?" The fourth man shook his head. "No matter the reason, we mustn't disturb her." And so they left her there in the 7th bed, and the 7th dwarf would sleep with his companions, switching beds every hour until the sun came. The next morning Snow White awoke, and when she saw the 7 dwarves she was frightened. But they were friendly, with faces that were kind and curious, and one of them asked her name. The princess sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "I am Snow White," she said softly. Then she told them that her stepmother had tried to kill her, and that she had run the entire day, finally coming upon their house. The dwarves said, "If you will cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything clean and orderly, then you can stay with us, and you shall have everything that you want." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." Far away in the cold stone halls of the castle, the queen awoke that morning feeling strange. Surely the effects of the wicked meal had manifested, and she rose from her bed, eager to see her beauty restored and youth renewed. But when she stood before the magic mirror, disgust filled her heart. The face that stared back at her was sallow and sunken, deeply marked by lines of age and pocked with craters. A terrible fury rose within the queen, and her scream echoed through the castle halls. She had been deceived. The princess had outwitted her. The heart she had consumed was not Snow White's. When her servant appeared, the queen beckoned him to summon the king, for she would command him to speak of her beauty, to affirm her perfection, as she had done countless times before. But the servant did not move with the usual haste. Instead, he looked at her grimly, his face pale with sorrow. "My queen," he began, Upon hearing of Snow White's passing in the forest, the king succumbed to grief too great to bear. The queen stood in silence, the weight of her deeds heavier than the crown upon her brow. "A mistake," she hissed. But the servant was steadfast. "His heart shattered, my queen. Our great king has passed into death's embrace." The queen's breath caught in her throat, and the servant lingered before he bowed his head and retreated. When she was alone, the wicked woman crossed to the magic mirror and said, "Mirror on the wall, where is that filthy little stain on the world, Snow White?" The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the reflection shifted to form an image of a cottage nestled deep in the forest, and inside the little glowing windows sat Snow White, her hair as pale as a winter corpse, her face serene and untouched. A scream tore from the queen's throat, like the howl of a wounded beast. "No!" she gasped, her voice rising to a shriek of fury. The queen slammed her fist against the glass, cracking it slightly, and she stumbled back, gasping for air. Her hand flew to her face, leaving a smear of blood across her cheek. But the wicked queen would not be thwarted by that little brat. She would not be humiliated by a child, and she would not rely on others to do her bidding any longer. Coloring her face with paints and powders, the queen disguised herself as an old peddler. She donned a tattered cloak and filled a basket with little trinkets, and made her way to the house of the 7 dwarves, where she knocked upon the door and called out, "Beautiful wares for sale, for sale!" Snow White, hearing the voice from the window, peeked out. "Good day, dear woman. What do you have for sale?" "Colorful silk corsets," the old woman said, pulling from the folds of her tattered cloak a lace so delicate it shimmered like a spider's web. "This one would suit you perfectly, little girl. Would you like it?" Snow White, innocent and trusting, thought only of the trinkets the woman offered. How kind she must be, she thought, as she unbolted the door and stepped outside. "Child," the peddler cackled, "how delicate you are. Let me lace you up properly." She stepped closer, and before Snow White could speak, the old woman wrapped the lace around the girl's waist, pulling so violently that Snow White gasped, her breath cut short. The silk tightened, choking her more with every tug, as the old woman laughed and laughed. With one final, vicious yank, the lace drew deathly tight, and Snow White crumpled to the ground, lifeless, before the door. The queen stood over her, her lips curled into a grim smile as she looked down at the girl. "At last, all eyes in the kingdom shall again belong to me." Not long afterward, the 7 men came home. How terrified they were when they saw their dear Snow White lying on the ground, not moving at all. They lifted her up, and seeing that she was too tightly laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then, faintly, she began to breathe again, and little by little she came back to life. When the wicked queen returned to her castle, she went straight to her mirror, certain that her rival was gone, and she herself would be named the fairest of them all. "Mirror on the wall," she asked, "who is the fairest of the land?" The mirror answered once again, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true. But Snow White is still 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard that, all her blood ran to her heart. "This time," she said, "I shall think of something that will destroy her once and for all." With the dark art of witchcraft, the queen forged a comb of poisoned ivory and wrapped herself in yet another disguise, this time as a sweet old woman. When she arrived at the little house, she knocked as she called, "Good wares for sale, for sale!" Snow White, peering out from the window, said, "Go on your way. I'm not allowed to let anyone in." But the woman, with a smile, crooned, "Surely you may take a look." She pulled out the poisoned comb, its sharp, gleaming teeth catching the light, and the child, too trusting and too innocent, saw the comb and admired its delicate craftsmanship, and without further hesitation, opened the door. "Now, let me comb your hair properly." And before Snow White could realize the danger, the cold fangs of the comb sank deep into her scalp, and the effects were instantaneous. Snow White's eyes fluttered, and within moments, she collapsed to the floor. "Now you are finished," said the wicked witch, and she turned and walked away, her ragged cloak billowing behind her like a shadow, leaving little Snow White lifeless on the ground. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarves soon returned home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as if she were dead, they examined her and found the poison comb tangled in her hair. They had scarcely pulled it out when Snow White's eyes opened, and she came to herself once again. "What happened?" she whispered sweetly. "You were poisoned," said the eldest man, and once again they warned her to never open the door for anyone. Back at the castle, the queen stepped before her mirror and said, "Mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of the land?" When the queen heard the mirror's answer, she screamed like a beast and swore, "Snow White will die if it costs me my life." Then she went to her most secret room and fashioned a poisoned apple. From the outside, it was perfect, white with red cheeks, and anyone who saw it would want it. But a single taste of its flesh promised death. The witch disguised herself as a peasant woman and set out across the 7 mountains for the little cottage in the woods. Upon hearing a knock at the door, Snow White stuck her head out the window and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone in." "Well, that's all right with me," answered the peasant woman. "Here, I'll pass you an apple through the window." "No, thank you," said Snow White. "I cannot accept anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" asked the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the red half, and I shall eat the white half." Snow White longed for the beautiful fruit, and when she saw that the peasant woman was eating part of it, she could no longer resist, and she stuck her hand out and took the other half of the apple, which had been so artfully made that only the red half was deathly. Snow White barely had a bite in her mouth when she fell to the ground, dead. The queen looked at her with a gruesome stare, laughed loudly, and said, "This time, no one can awaken you." Back at the castle, the magic mirror finally answered, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." And her envious heart was at rest. When the dwarves came home, Snow White was dead. They lifted her up and looked for something poisonous, They undid her laces, they combed her hair, they washed her with water and wine, but nothing helped. The dear princess was gone. They laid her on a platform and sat next to her and mourned for 3 days. Then they were going to bury her, but she still had her beautiful red cheeks and looked as fresh as a living person. Instead, they had a transparent glass coffin made so she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside, and with golden letters inscribed on it her name, and that she was a princess. Then they put the coffin outside on a mountain, and one of them always stayed with it and watched over her. Now it came to pass that a prince entered these woods, and happened onto the coffin on the mountain with beautiful Snow White in it, and he read what was written on it with golden letters. His heart filled with sorrow and admiration upon seeing her breathtaking beauty. Then he said to the dwarves, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you anything you want for it." But the dwarves answered, "We will not sell it for any gold in the world." Then the prince said, "Then give it to me, for I cannot live without being able to see Snow White's beauty, her rosy cheeks and frosty hair. I will honor her and respect her as my most cherished one." As he thus spoke, the good dwarves felt pity for him and gave him the coffin. The prince had his servants carry it away on their shoulders, but one of them stumbled on some brush, and this dislodged from Snow White's throat the piece of poisoned apple that she had bitten off. Not long afterward, she opened her eyes, lifted the lid from her coffin, and was alive again. "Good heavens!" she cried out. "Where am I?" The prince, overcome with joy, told her what had happened and asked for her hand in marriage, and together they went to his father's castle, and their wedding was planned with great majesty. Snow White's godless stepmother was invited to the feast, and her vanity could not resist the opportunity to show herself in all her finery. She dressed in her most beautiful clothes and glistening jewels, and stood before her mirror. "Mirror on the wall," she said, "who is the fairest of the land?" The mirror answered, "Your reign has ended. Try as you might. The prince's true love is one little Snow White." The witch uttered a curse, and without thinking, seized a nearby candlestick and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered like thunder, scattering across the room, and the mirror, once her faithful servant, was in ruins. Her reflection was gone. The wicked stepmother did not want to go to the wedding, but she knew she had to see the young queen for herself, to confirm the mirror's terrible truth. And so she began to plot her final act of vengeance. She took a pair of iron shoes, heavy and crude, and bewitched them so they appeared light and pretty. But once laced, their true nature would be revealed. She planned to present them as a wedding gift, but without her magic mirror, the queen's attempts to alter her appearance were clumsy and ineffective. In the end, she buried herself in layers of fabric and hunched over so far that she was nearly horizontal, and headed for the celebration dressed as a beggar woman. When she arrived at the wedding, the guards barred her way, and the wicked witch wept with feigned sorrow. "Please," she begged, "I raised little Snow White from a baby. I shan't miss her wedding day. It would break my heart." The guards exchanged uneasy glances as Snow White herself appeared at the gate, radiant in her wedding gown. "Who are you?" the sweet bride asked gently, eyeing the hunched figure before her. The witch bowed her head. "I have traveled far to see you on this joyous day. I am but a poor woman who once cared for you, my dear." Snow White's memory failed to place the woman, but as she studied her appearance, her kindness outweighed her suspicions. "Let her in," she said to the guards. "It is a day of celebration, and no one should be turned away." The guards stepped aside, and the witch shuffled into the castle. She attempted to give Snow White the shoes right away. "My dear," she sang, "I have brought you a wedding gift. These shoes will make you the most graceful dancer in the land." But Snow White gently shook her head. "Thank you, but let us wait until the first dance. I would not want to spoil the surprise." The witch nodded, her hands tightening around the shoes. She would have to wait, but not for long. Meanwhile, the dwarves who had also been invited to the wedding watched the old woman with sharp eyes, and when they saw the shoes in her hands, they recognized the work of witchcraft. While the queen was distracted, they stole the shoes and threw them into the burning coals of the castle's hearth, hoping to destroy them. But the shoes did not burn. The grand ballroom was filled with music and laughter when the newlywed couple made their entrance after the ceremony. The wicked witch, her patience worn thin, could wait no longer. She pushed her way to the center of the floor, her voice rising above the music. "Servants," she called, "bring Snow White her dancing shoes. She must wear them for the first dance." The room fell silent, and Snow White looked at the woman, and the dwarves stepped forward, gripping the red-hot dancing shoes with large tongs. "These are no gift for a bride," the eldest man declared. "They have been cursed to bring her harm." Before the queen could react, the 7 dwarves surrounded her, taking hold of her limbs and thrusting the shoes onto her feet. Her burning flesh sizzled and smoked as the iron seared her skin, and the witch filled the hall with screams of agony. The cursed shoes forced her to dance, their black magic enchanting her body into frantic, uncontrollable spins. Round and round she whirled, her screams echoing through the ballroom as the heat of the iron burned deeper and the stench of charred flesh filled the air. And still, the wicked witch danced. The woman's horrible, twisted face and terrible, ungodly cries began to thaw away Snow White's buried past, and soon she knew exactly who the beggar woman was. "Stepmother," she whispered. Finally, with one last, horrible screech, the witch stumbled and fell, her charred feet unable to carry her any further. She collapsed on the floor, her body shuddering, as the guests gaped in horror at the fallen queen. The hall was now silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the faint hiss of cooling iron. Snow White stepped forward, her eyes filled with sorrow, as snowflakes, delicate and shimmering, began to flutter around her like little bees with wings of frost. The wedding guests gasped in awe and whispered with wonder as Snow White reached out toward the smoldering witch's form, and her little frozen workers snuffed the flames like a candle. Let this be an end to her cruelty, she said softly. May she find peace in death, as we have found peace in life. After a brief and joyous honeymoon, Snow White and her prince returned to their new castle, their hearts light with happiness. The dwarves, ever loyal, arrived soon after, carrying Snow White's old belongings from the wicked queen's castle. Then Snow White, with eyes bright as morning dew, smiled and spoke thus. You have ever been my true family, and it is only right that you no longer dwell in such a humble place. I know of a grand castle, at last empty of its cruel queen, where far more than 7 bedchambers stand waiting, and more than 7 of every dish lie unused. If it pleases you, dear friends, take it as your own, and let the halls ring with laughter once more. The dwarves looked upon one another with wide, joyous eyes, and a great cheer rose from their throats. In a flurry of excitement, they hurried off to cross the 7 mountains and gather their humble belongings from the little cottage that had served them so well. As Snow White sifted through the remnants of her past, her fingers brushed against something jagged. There, half buried in the dusty trinkets, lay the broken frame of the magic mirror. She lifted it gently, and in that instant, a chill swept through the air. Not of winter, but something much older, something ancient. A sleek layer of ice began to form before her eyes, shimmering faintly like frost on a winter's morn. And soon, the mirror's surface was perfection again. For the first time, Snow White saw her true reflection, not just of her face, but of her very soul. She was no longer the girl who had fled into the woods. She was a queen, and she stood there in the morning sunlight, grown up but a child at heart. And it was summer. Warm, beautiful summer.